This is Mike. He is going to chat to us for the next 20 minutes or so. Mike, who are you?
I'm Mike. I live in Cambridge. I'm married to Rachel, who's over there. And I work here. Amazingly, it is my job to eat this food with you. What a joy.
Lovely. And Mike, you studied English, is that right?
I did.
What are you reading at the moment? What are you enjoying?
I mean, at the moment, I'm actually mostly listening to things. So I've been listening to a book called The Second Mountain by David Brooks, which is quite an interesting sort of about, I won't try and explain. I'm also always, me and Rachel are listening to a Harry Potter at all times. So Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix at the moment.
Brilliant. It's a good one. I will leave you to it. Everybody else, please keep eating and listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Phoebe. So tonight, as you'll have gathered, we're thinking about our response to suffering. But I want to take us kind of to a slightly deeper level than what do we do to help. I want us to think about what is our deep down reaction to suffering and injustice in the world. I don't know if you remember how you felt when you first saw the footage of George Floyd's death, or how you felt when you saw what happened on October the 7th, or what has been happening in Gaza ever since. How do you feel when you see this stuff? Or how about when we think about struggles closer to home? I think of people really close to me who've spent their whole adult lives in this exhausting, relentless battle with mental health. Or maybe we're in chronic pain, or maybe it's more that we've had to watch someone that we love suffer. Or perhaps we've even lost someone very close to us. My question is, how do we feel about those things? Do we feel naturally like, oh, well, it's probably all for the best? Do we feel like, oh, well, this is just the way it is? No. We hate it, don't we? Whether it's human evil or whether it's just the cruelties of sickness and death, I don't know about you, but I don't think, oh, well, this is just the way it is. I hate it. I'm angry about it. I think it shouldn't be like this. And I don't think that that's just a personal preference, like thinking, I'm not thinking that it's wrong in the sense that someone might think it's wrong for there to be pineapple on pizza. I actually think like that is a deep down reality that this is not right. This is not how things should be. I feel very deeply that that's true. Do you? And I think depending on our beliefs, it might be that that makes us feel kind of angry about these things in general, or it might mean that we feel angry with God sometimes. And of course, this is one of the hardest things for people who believe in a loving God, is that the anger of looking at the world and thinking, this is not how it should be. This is not right. But I want to say tonight that the more deeply I think about this, the more I'm actually convinced that suffering and injustice are not a reason that we can't believe in God. I actually think that our reaction to suffering is a powerful reason to believe in God, specifically the God that we meet in Jesus. Why do I say that? Well, let me compare, to show you what I mean, two very different reactions to death. The first is from the brilliant atheist journalist Christopher Hitchens. Speaking about his own terminal cancer diagnosis, he once said this: "To the dumb question, why me? The cosmos barely bothers to return the reply, why not?" It's commendably brave and honest, isn't it? He's being incredibly consistent with his beliefs, because as an atheist, he thought that this material world is all there is. This world of death and pain and suffering, this is it. It's come from nowhere, it's going nowhere for no reason. It's all there ever has been and all there ever will be. And that means two things. One, it means that death is completely natural. We were talking on our table about Mrs. Gren, the things that something needs to be alive, but actually every single living thing dies. It's the most natural thing in the world. And two, selfishness and violence are completely natural. We are animals competing to survive. And yet, in many situations, cooperation might work better than all-out war, but that's not something deep in the universe. That's just a good tactic. Selfishness and violence are just natural. So, of course, he can't say, this is not right, this is not how things should be. If he says, this isn't how things should be, the cosmos just replies, why not? And I've picked an atheist example there, but actually there are all sorts of different worldviews that would land us in the same place. Whether it's the idea of detachment, that all suffering is just part of this world of illusion and we shouldn't get too attached to it, or the idea of karma, that actually all suffering is deserved, or the idea of fate, that all suffering is exactly as it's meant to be. In all of those perspectives, we can't look at injustice and suffering and death and say, this is not right. This is not how things should be. So let me contrast that view with a very different response to death. It's actually the shortest verse in the whole Bible. In the account that we're going to look at tonight, Jesus comes face to face with his friend Mary's grief at the death of her brother Lazarus. And Jesus responds by weeping. John tells us Jesus wept. So whatever else Jesus might say and do in response to our suffering, he does not say, don't cry, it's just the way it is. Don't cry, it's actually all for the best. He weeps. He grieves. He hates it. According to the God we meet in Jesus, this is actually not how things should be. So my question is, which one of these two perspectives on the world rings true to you? Which makes better sense of why we react to suffering and injustice the way we do? We'll come back to that question, but first let's see more fully the Jesus view of suffering by looking at the whole story. On these tables, you've got these little books. Pick one up if you can see one, the little blue books, and open it up to page 34. This is a biography of Jesus written by John, who was one of his closest friends and followers. And John insists in this book that he is testifying to things that he has seen himself. And here on page 34, he tells us in a huge amount of detail about a situation that happened not long before Jesus himself was arrested and killed. So let's just read the first few sentences from the big number 11 at the bottom of page 34 as John sets the scene. Now a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is ill. When he heard this, Jesus said, this illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now we'll stop there for a minute because that is a really weird thing to say, isn't it? A really weird response to the situation. And I think it sounds weird to us partly because we're not used to people using the word glory like Jesus does here. When Jesus uses glory, he's talking about God being made visible. God is glorified when his nature, his character, is seen and felt. And when Jesus talks about God's Son, that's how he describes himself. So saying it is for God's glory so that God's Son may be glorified through it, Jesus is basically saying, this situation is going to reveal who God is by revealing who I am. And actually, that's something that Jesus talks about a lot. He said that he was God coming into the world as a human being so that he can show us what God is really like. There's actually a moment a few chapters on in this biography where someone says to Jesus, just show us God. Just show us the Father. That would be enough for us. And Jesus says, don't you know me? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen God. So Jesus is saying here in this account to us, Do you want to know how God responds to suffering? Well, I am God, so look at me. So the story goes on. We won't read all of the details, but in the conversation that follows, Jesus explains to them that actually Lazarus isn't now just ill, he's died. But he says that he is going there to wake him up. He says, I'm going to raise him back to life. And when he gets there, the first one of the sisters to meet him is Martha. So we'll just turn the page over to the next page and look at the interaction that he has with Martha, starting at the little number 21. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So at this point, Martha has got some hope for her brother. She's got a kind of vague, slightly theoretical hope based on what she's read in the Old Testament that at the last day, at the end of history, he'll be raised to life again. But it's kind of a bit distant and a bit vague. But look at the different level of hope that Jesus offers her. Sentence number 25. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Jesus says to her, you don't need to rely on vague, theoretical hope because certain hope is standing right in front of you. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. He says, anyone who trusts me will have in me a life that is actually stronger than death. A life that starts right now and that nothing can take away. And he asks her, do you believe this? Do you trust me? She says, yes. And then she goes and tells her sister Mary that Jesus is here. And Mary comes out, and the two sisters are different. And so when Mary comes out to meet him, Jesus responds to her very differently. So we'll see that it's sentence number 32, just down the page. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? So let's take a step back for a moment and think about this. Jesus has told the disciples already that he is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He knows that it is all going to change, that everything is going to be made right again in a few minutes' time. But that doesn't mean that he thinks it's okay. We read that he's deeply moved and troubled. And the words there, they almost mean like he's angry. Not angry with Mary, but with death itself. He is deeply moved. He weeps. He hates seeing her in agony like this. He hates the damage that death does in this world. When Jesus looks at that, he feels the same reality that we feel. That this is not how things should be. Jesus weeps. That is how God responds to suffering and death. This is the God that I believe in. And I think, to be honest, that this is the only God that I could believe in. You know, when I think about the people I love who have suffered horrendous evil at the hands of other people, or family members who've had to bury their own child, I don't know if I could bring myself to believe in a God who was aloof and kind of smugly sitting in the sky looking down on all of it, not knowing what it's like, not really caring. But I can believe in this God. The God who has come in Jesus and who cares so much that he weeps with us, and ultimately that cares so much that he dies with us. I do believe and trust in the God who cares that much. So I imagine many of us might be thinking, if God thinks that this isn't how things should be, then why is it like this? Why does all this terrible stuff happen? Well, the whole story of the Bible teaches very clearly that it's not because God likes suffering and death. It's not because God wants suffering and death. This is not how the world was made to be. The Bible insists that our world is broken. How come? Well, this is really interesting because the Bible actually teaches that the deepest level of reality is not just atoms bouncing around. The most fundamental level of reality is relationships. And the Bible says that humanity as a whole has rejected and ignored the God who made us and who loves us. And we have broken that fundamental relationship with God. And that has broken everything. Our world is broken because our relationship with God is broken. That broken relationship is why humans are so often selfish and greedy. It's also why we are mortal and vulnerable. And it's actually also why even our physical world is shattered and full of sharp edges. None of that is how it should be. It is all broken because of our broken relationship with God. But the good news is that means that if that relationship with God is restored, there is hope for everything. And Jesus here doesn't just show us that this is not how things should be. He shows us that this is not how things will always be. Let's read on. I love the little details, the visual, emotional details in this next bit. You can imagine that this moment was just deeply imprinted on John's memory. So from the top of the next page, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he's been in there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Jesus' words to Martha about resurrection and life were not just empty promises. They were not empty words. In fact, quite the opposite. It turns out here that Jesus' words are so full of authority that he can call Lazarus out of death itself, and Lazarus comes. Jesus is the God who spoke life into being in the first place. And here he speaks life out of death. He is the resurrection and the life. Martha was right to trust him because he was telling the truth. With Jesus, there actually is solid hope beyond death. And this is not just for Martha or Lazarus, it's for anyone. Jesus promised that anyone who will believe in him, he will do for us what he did for Lazarus. He will give us new life, but actually better than that. Because he will give us an everlasting life in a whole, healed, restored world where he will wipe away every tear from our eyes. And he will give us a body that is not broken anymore, a mind that is not broken anymore, a soul that is not broken anymore and will never be broken again. So which view of the world rings true to you? Why not? Well, Jesus wept. I heard a guy being interviewed once who'd been an atheist his whole life, and then when he was about 40, he became a Christian by reading an atheist philosopher who said that we were just animals, and so there was nothing wrong with hurting another person for your own enjoyment. He said that was actually natural. Why not? And this guy said in the interview that he read that and he realized that it was completely logical. He said, "I couldn't deny the logic." But he said at the same time, I was absolutely sure that that was not right, that that was not okay. And he said in the interview, that was the only leap of faith I ever took. That after that, it was just logically thinking through what could actually explain his conviction that that is not okay. And he said the only thing that really made sense was Jesus. My point is, yes, as a Christian, I am left with what philosophers call the problem of evil. If God is completely powerful and he's completely loving, then why does any of this stuff happen? But I want to have a problem with evil. And actually, logically, the alternative to the Christian problem of evil is to not have a problem with evil. It's almost time for me to stop talking and for you to discuss round tables, but let me address one last thing. Some of us might be hearing this and thinking, okay, sure, but doesn't that problem of evil just logically disprove God? And the answer is, no, not really. As a philosophical argument, it actually only works if you bring in a huge bunch of assumptions, many of which are really quite shaky and are very Western and modernist assumptions. Just to take one big example, the argument only really sort of disproves God if you assume that if there was a good reason for God to allow suffering, humans would definitely be able to see it and understand it. But we have no reason to think that that's true. Let me show you what I mean, even just from this story. If you open it up again and look back at page 35, one of the little bits that we kind of skipped over, we'll look at sentence number 5 to 8. So it says, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, 'Let us go back to Judea.' But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there were tried to stone you, and yet you are going back?" So why did Jesus wait for 2 days before he went to go and help? It seems totally crazy and callous, doesn't it? Why didn't he go straight away? And the truth is, I don't know. I'm not really sure why he did that. But I don't think that means that he can't have had a good reason. I don't think it proves that he can't really have loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha. And that is true on the big scale too. If God is actually God, if he is big enough for us to be angry with him for allowing all the suffering in the world, then he is also big enough that we might not always understand what he is doing. So the problem of evil is actually not so much a philosophical, logical problem as a relational one. The relational problem is, if we don't understand everything, then how can we actually be sure that God really loves us? And again, I think this story points us towards the answer. How could we know that Jesus really did love Mary and Martha and Lazarus? Well, did you notice how the disciples told him not to go there at all? They said it was too dangerous. So Bethany in Judea, where this family lived, it was back in the territory of the religious authorities who a bit before had tried to stone Jesus to death. And if you read on after the bit we've read tonight, you see that the disciples were right. As the word spreads about what he's done with Lazarus, the religious authorities start in earnest to plan how to murder him. And Jesus knew they were going to do that. So how do we know Jesus loved Lazarus and his sisters? Jesus was willing to risk his own death to give Lazarus life. And if you read on further, you discover that it is the same for us. Jesus allowed their murder plans to succeed. He allows himself to be arrested and tortured and brutally executed. And he says that he is dying like that on purpose for us, for anyone who would believe in him. Jesus died our death in our place so that he could share with us his resurrection life. Jesus dies the death that all of us deserve for us so that we can share the life beyond death that only he deserves. How can we know that God really loves us? Because in Jesus, we see that God loves us to death. So if you're a Christian here tonight and you are suffering and you just don't understand why God isn't stopping it, let me say this. I don't know why God isn't stopping it. And you may never know. But whatever the reason is, it can't be because he doesn't love you. If he didn't love you, why would he have died for you? It can't be because he doesn't love you. It must be because he does. How can anyone know for sure whether or not God really loves us? We can look at Jesus. And so, whether you've been a Christian for decades or this is the first time you've ever set foot in a church, really for all of us, it comes down to the same question. What do you make of Jesus? And we really want to give you a chance, whatever your perspective is, to have a fresh look at Jesus for yourself in these 3 evenings, to think about what you make of him, to ask your questions, to explore. So we've got half an hour now over tea and coffee for you to discuss this account on your tables. And your table hosts have got some questions to start the conversation, but feel free to ask your own questions as well. I'm looking forward to hearing what people think. Thank you very much for listening.